So without further ado, I will hand over to Daniel and Catherine.
Thank you ever so much. I think Catherine is going to start us off. I don't know. I can't see much. Catherine, are you with us?
Yeah, I'm here.
Hello.
Hello. Stephen's got some slides, hopefully, that he's going to share for us. Oh.
And I suppose just by way of introduction, before we kick off, I'm Dan G. I'm Assistant Director of Education with responsibility for North East Essex. And Catherine, but like news presenters here, over to you.
I'm Catherine Hartley. I'm the Assistant Director for Education for Mid Essex. Okay, so what we want to do this evening, you may have been in some of our previous briefings, in the director's briefing or the bespoke inclusion governors briefings previously. So we'll try not to be too repetitive, but obviously we want to be very clear about the material and the concepts that we're sharing. But we are hoping, obviously, that there may be an opportunity for a little bit more interaction, questions as we go through. So obviously, we'll take questions at the end, but please, if you've got any questions as we go through, just interrupt or use the chat. That's absolutely fine. So we're going to focus this session on inclusion, which is obviously an ever-increasing priority for us at Essex, but increasingly, thankfully, nationally as well. So we're going to look at inclusion, the strategy, and what this means for your schools as governors. Thank you, Stephen. So just to give a quick overview, we launched the inclusion strategy and the initial support offer that goes with it in September last year. And lots and lots of schools are engaging in the support offer, as well as working alongside us to collaborate on the ongoing development of the strategy and the components within it. We have recognised the continuing challenges, not least the financial challenges that our schools are facing, but obviously we have our own very significant challenges as well at the local authority. So the whole purpose of the strategy is how we can best come alongside our schools to work in a different way to help support with the ever-changing cohort that we're seeing in mainstream education. We have been very, very fortunate internally that we have a political backing for the transformation work that this work sits under, and we have had £1.7 million agreed from Essex County Council to help us fund the next stage of the inclusion strategy and the support offer. And that's Essex County Council money that we would not otherwise see in education. And we're obviously continuing, I've said already, it's a huge priority for us. Inclusion in Essex has been for a number of years, but we continue to lobby for change nationally. And we're working now with the DFE, with Ofsted. We are looking forward to what the new Ofsted report card may look like, and very much hoping that inclusion will be a strong component of that, and that work that our most inclusive schools do will be rewarded appropriately. So that's the context in which we're working with the strategy. If we go on, please, Stephen. When we release these slides to you, just so you've got the direct links, you can find the strategy on the school's info link, but there's also a link there to a page tiger or a QR code that you can follow directly to get to the strategy. So equity and excellence and inclusion strategy for Essex. Thank you, Stephen. So we wrote the strategy now back in 2022. We were looking at the data and the picture that we were working with then, and we shared this with governors, as I say, in a range of briefings. But in 2022, overall progress and attainment of Essex pupils was too low. The strategy has a spotlight on SEND and disadvantaged pupils. It's an inclusion strategy, so it is for all children, but we have that spotlight because we are particularly concerned about the progress and outcomes for those children and young people. We were seeing at the time continued increase in absence, persistent absence, in suspensions, permanent exclusions, and electively home education. And we were seeing huge concerns and schools really struggling to meet the needs of children with social, emotional, mental health needs, and you will be well aware of this as governors. We were undoubtedly seeing the impact of the pandemic, both in terms of the impact on children and young people, but also in terms of funding, recruitment, and the other things that went on around that. And unprecedented demand in other areas away from education, but mental health services, social care, and so on and so forth. And it is no secret to anybody that huge increases in the numbers of children coming through for statutory assessment into our services that have caused huge pressure on the system. So that was back in 2022. Has the position changed significantly since the establishment of the position that we were working in? Overall progress and attainment remains too low, and the gap between disadvantaged children and their peers has actually grown further. Attendance has slightly improved for primary, but secondary does still remain a concern and is higher than pre-pandemic levels. And there is some very stark and significant research that shows us that children's happiness is continuing to decline. This is national research. And mental health disorders in children are rising. So that is obviously additional to the original position that we were working to. A recent study predicts that the educational impact of the pandemic will continue for children into the 2030s, with generations of pupils set for the biggest declines in GCSE results for decades. And we know that access to services and timescales for assessment have actually worsened during that period of time. So that is quite a bleak picture, but hopefully what we will share with you this evening will show that the inclusion strategy and the work of your leaders in your schools is really starting to show fruition, and has really given us an opportunity to come alongside and work with schools together in that picture rather than separately. Thank you, Stephen. The strategy itself is divided into 3 pillars. Sometimes we divide it into 6, but the 3 pillars form the foundations of inclusion in education. They're absolutely informed by research and by engagement with families, our schools and our young people. And all of the evidence that we've been capturing over the last 2 academic years really support the concept that these pillars build on each other, and they benefit of a collective shared language around inclusion. And the more work we do, the more we see that actually it does go from left to right. If you do not have relationships and wellbeing in place, if they are not strong, there is an impact on attendance and participation. If the children are not attending and participating, then clearly how they achieve and how they move on to the next steps is affected. So we really do see that investment in relationships and wellbeing being ever more prevalent and important. Thank you. Dan, I'm going to hand to you there.
Thank you very much. This is a really important slide. One of the things that we wanted, well, there are a number of things that we wanted to do, and one of the key elements to get alongside school leaders and to acknowledge the challenges. I think if we're going to make any change, we can't just say, oh, here's some things that we think might work. I think from an ECC perspective, we felt it was particularly important that we got alongside leaders and said, look, we know there are challenges, and these are the challenges, and be quite open and honest about it. And Catherine shared that in the work around the position statement. Another thing that we wanted to do was to be really clear with leaders that the work that we were doing around the inclusion strategy was A, relevant, and B, wouldn't take them off in a tangent. And so there are 3 documents that once as Stephen presses through, you'll see. The first document you can see, which is pretty small, is just the paper version of the inclusion strategy. And what you can see in letters A to F are the 6 pillars that Catherine talked about. If you just click once more, please, Stephen. What we then did, and we were really pleased with this because we did this after we'd written the strategy. The DFE produced their descriptors for high quality inclusive trusts, and this is something that was gaining traction when it was published by the DFE, and certainly with the change of government, it's gained further traction. We've had quite a bit of interest in the DFE in terms of working with us to see what we're doing around inclusion and our strategy. But what I did in a sort of train spotter way, if you just clock the yellow column at the end of the table, you can see is we cross-referenced what the DFE said they felt was important in high quality inclusive schools with what our 6 pillars of our strategy are, and you really, it's incredibly close in terms of what we've committed to with our inclusion strategy and what the DfE are looking for around highly inclusive schools. And then if you click once more, Stephen, to take the geekiness further, I then spent quite a bit of time with the Ofsted handbook and took every bullet point in the Ofsted handbook and pasted them under the 6 pillars where they were relevant. And probably 85% of the bullet points under the good descriptor sat very, very neatly under the pillars of the strategy. And that was particularly important for us from a strategic point of view, to be able to say to school leaders, look, there is a real challenge in the system. We are committed to supporting and doing stuff to try and get alongside and help. But what we are doing is tightly aligned with what the DfE are pushing with their trust descriptors, and also what how it aligns with Ofsted. Because again, we know these are key things that school leaders will be conscious of, and we don't want to be working at cross purposes. Next slide, please, Stephen. So in terms of this slide is really key. One of the things that we felt it was absolutely crucial to be able to say to school leaders, and this was last September, is this is what we're going to do. Because it's one thing to share publicly, this is the position, and it's another thing to be able to stand there and say, and our position and our strategy aligns with what Ofsted are doing and aligns with the work that the DfE are now pushing. But if we've been head teachers, and we can be cynical bunches of head teachers. That I'm saying, if I'm a head, I'm going to be thinking, okay, well, that's nice. We know there's challenges, and we know that we need to do something about it. But what are you going to do differently? And that was the key drive of our work last year, is to be able to say to school leaders, look, we want to try and do something that is different, that will help and will have an impact, and actually won't cost you any money, because there's a real consciousness around that. And so we launched the inclusion framework that had been piloted for a number of years. We also launched the inclusion reviews for the first time. And as the year progressed, we developed a training offer called Ready to Regulate. And certainly the inclusion framework gave school leaders the opportunity to actually bid for funds to drive inclusion, while the inclusion reviews and Ready to Regulate were offered as products that are high quality, but again, we didn't charge. We offered them as free to school leaders. And what we'll sort of do now is just to give you a quick run through of what we did last year, and then how that links to what we're doing this year in relation to those offers. So this is the headline of the activity from last year. So I'll go from top left and down that column. So as we sort of talked about already, we launched the strategy, and that strategy was funded by Essex County Council, and we undertook a range of inclusion reviews and research visits. We went out to the sector quite early last academic year, and we sort of talked about what the strategy was about, and we talked about the opportunity to have reviews, and we were fully booked up for the year within about a week. There was significant demand from school leaders, and so we've undertaken a range of reviews, and we'll talk a bit about the findings of those reviews later on. And we also, as part of the process, is we undertake research visits locally and more further afield, because it's really important, as well as being able to go into schools and look at strengths, but also look at areas for development, to be able to offer some concrete examples of where stuff is working elsewhere that mightn't be working in the school. It's helpful to go in and point out what's not working, but actually it's more helpful to be able to point people in the right direction of where things are having an impact elsewhere. So that was a key piece of work, as well as the rollout of the inclusion framework that I talked about, which was an opportunity for school leaders to work on early intervention, and we've seen some really interesting and impactful projects of where the framework has been used to drive inclusion and to really provide young people with a much better offer. And Catherine will talk about that a bit later on. We've done a number of inclusion conferences, which have been, again, impactful and powerful in bringing together national speakers, local head teachers, SENCOs, inclusion leads, and a whole range of colleagues to just start and continue the conversation around inclusive practice. Ready to Regulate, again, we'll talk about a bit later on, but we've devised a really impactful and important program to support school leaders to look at how they can implement trauma-informed practice on the ground. And the longer term piece of work is actually, from an ECC perspective, looking at how we align our workforce behind the pillars, and how we support to improve practice across whether it's attendance, participation, and relationships, for example. So that's a headline summary of the key work that we did in 23-24. And the next slide will just talk a little bit about what we are doing this year. And so the work has really kicked on. So in terms of the strategy, the strategy hasn't changed, and that's one of the key things. It's absolutely crucial that, you know, we can't chop and change stuff. We've committed to the key pillars and the work that underpins that. But what we're now trying to do is to sort of deepen the strategy, for example, developing inclusion dashboards, really getting under the surface of what we mean by the spotlight on SEND and disadvantage, develop more conferences, further briefings. So there's a whole range of activity that we're doing this year to really embed, deepen, and broaden the strategy. And again, with reviews, we've had massive, really pleased with the take-up of reviews. We sort of decided quite quickly we needed to double the number of reviews that we offer this year compared to last year. One of the things that we started to do last year, as well as offering reviews to individual schools, is we did a couple of really impactful pilots with multi-academy trusts. And what we decided this year is actually we'd like to develop that. So we thought we'd go out to trusts, but also to partnerships, and offer them not quite an early bird sign up, but to get expressions of interest from trusts and partnerships before we launched it with individual schools and academies. And we got within a week or 2 weeks, we've gone from offering 40 reviews last year to about 80 reviews this year. We were booked up within 10 days, 14 days before we even got to the stage of being able to offer them to individual schools. So we're now in the process of delivering the increased amount of reviews, but also looking at how we put more capacity into the system, because the demand is still there from standalone schools and academies. And again, the framework continues to grow. We've built a case for further funding so we can get that into schools. And we're developing our approaches to the panels and trying to give school leaders new approaches to guidance to make their applications more straightforward. But again, I suppose what we're doing as we go through all of these key activities is what we're doing in 24-25 is not anything different from 23-24. It's about deepening, increasing the reach, and trying to further increase the impact. So again, similarly with Ready to Regulate, the pilots that were developed in 23-24 are now being rolled out further with improvement partners, rolling out into the early years sector, developing Ready to Regulate packages for families, and also developing approaches from across maths to have Ready to Regulate training and develop that. And beyond that, again, a key piece of work that we're driving on this year is to develop delivery plans from us at an ECC level, and saying, okay, we've got these key 6 pillars. What are our plans over the next 5 years to actually, as well as doing reviews and offering opportunities to bid for inclusion framework funding and giving people Ready to Regulate training, a bit more strategically, what is the ECC perspective over the next 5 to 6 years to really drive and support schools and academies to develop and embed relationships, to improve attendance, to really look at approaches to transition and moving on. So there's a significant amount of work that is already ongoing this year, and certainly will continue at pace. And again, this sort of gives a summary of some of the things that we're trying to sort of do under those key plans that we're looking at from an ECC point of view. So from an overarching point of view, we're looking at how we sort of respond to inclusion reviews. It's one thing to go into school after school or through some big trusts where we're doing maybe 10 or 12 reviews, individual reviews in trusts. But once we've done all of those reviews, what is the next step? What can we offer schools, academies, trusts to actually work together, learn from each other, and really sort of drive on in those areas that they need to support? We're looking at a digital solution to the inclusion framework and an inclusion dashboard that we've talked about before. We're continuing to look at our best practice visits, but look at how we can engage school leaders in those visits with us. And then as we go across the other sort of the 3 pillars, from a relationships and wellbeing perspective, as I sort of talked about on the previous slide, one of the key jobs of work that we're looking at this year is how we develop that Ready to Regulate offer for early years providers and how we develop it for families. Catherine is currently leading on a pilot process under our relationship section about how we provide early access to family support workers for schools, because that's an area that we feel has got real opportunities. In terms of our work around attendance and participation, we're currently looking more nationally at what is working around these key issues around attendance, and certainly how can we bring that into Essex, and how we offer additional support and bring that into Essex. And under the Achieving and Moving On pillars, we're currently sort of developing a pilot about how we get teams of specialist support assistants. We know that schools can't simply just afford to go and appoint staff. And I'm sure as governors, that's something that you'll be working closely with your teams about, staffing budgets. But to what extent can we employ staff and then second staff into school on short term roles to try and sort of directly impact young people where it's absolutely needed. And we're also piloting a transition project called Stay, which again is really important. And these are key things that we're sort of developing. We'll continue to push through this year.
Daniel, may I ask a question, please?
Certainly.
Yeah, when you talk about going into the schools, I mean, how do you identify a school that's going to need help to start with? And what does the best practice visits do? What do you do when you have a best practice visit?
Well, I think what we've tried to do in terms of how we identify schools, that's a really good point, because hitherto that the focus has actually been working with schools to say, look, this is not something we are doing to you. We are not. This is not Ofsted. We are not deciding where we go. We are sort of taking the. What's the best way of phrasing it? We're taking the offer to schools, and we are standing in front of leaders saying, "This is really important. You're struggling with this. We want to offer to try and support and help you. And if you'd like us to come into a review, please ask." And the approach certainly in the first year was very much around making the offer to schools, as opposed to going to schools and saying, look, we think you need a review. Because certainly we want doors to be open, especially in some of our schools that are less inclusive, where we know that there are concerns. If we suddenly go in and say we want to do a review, especially if those schools are academies, they're just going to say no. And so it's been very much around in the first year, making that offer broadly, a lot of PR, trying to really get some real strength in terms of feedback where we've done the reviews, so that the reviews, our evidence has been high quality, our evidence has been collaborative, and our evidence has been non-judgmental. And that's been a really important part of it. As the time has progressed, we've started to work internally from an ECC perspective in quadrants and saying, look, do we know where we've got some concerns? And actually, how can we start to work alongside school leaders with our sort of business as usual meetings? Say, look, we know you're concerned about this. You're raising this as a concern. Have you thought about having this sort of review? And so as the time has progressed, they have become more targeted where we've had conversations. But it's been really important in terms of the work we've done so far, not to simply start looking at schools thinking, right, that school needs review or that school needs review, because we want to sort of bring people alongside with us. And we were very conscious that if we started to launch this and simply said, right, let's find the schools we're worried about, let's go and start saying, do you want a review? That actually people might become quite defensive, and actually it wouldn't have the impact that we wanted to have.
So you're seeking the schools are seeking you really in the first place?
In the first place, it was very much about making the offer more broadly, getting schools to come and buy into it. And then as the year progressed, when we sort of met with quadrant teams to say to quadrant teams, look, we're going to set aside certain days where we won't book in reviews, where you can keep them free, so that as you start to get intelligence about schools that you might have some concerns about, you can then start to have conversations with those schools to see if they'd like to have a review. And so, yeah, initially it was broad brush who would like one, but we did that alongside keeping certain days free so that we could target it a bit more precisely with our quadrant teams.
Okay, thank you very much.
And sorry, the second question, Julie, was about the best practice visits. Can you just repeat that?
Oh, yes, yeah. I just wondered what the best practice visits would be. How would you do it? You go in and tell people what they should be doing, or?
No. So what we do is we've got a team of colleagues who use a criteria to find schools nationally that are doing really well, but have similar contexts to our schools, and then they go in and they've been going in looking at the pillars and actually saying, right, let's go in and meet with head teachers, meet with CEOs, walk around the schools, talk to the kids, and actually find out what is it that the schools are doing, why is it working well, and what we've tasked them with doing is trying to sort of bring back the evidence under the pillars of the strategy, so that we can then start to directly link, where we've got schools that are struggling with, developing approaches to well-being. Well, actually, this school in London or this school in Liverpool has done some really positive work on well-being, and just to sort of try and signpost people in that regard. Well, I think one of the things that we have found, and this isn't rocket science, but where we are doing best practice visits, it's not, well, the real success isn't in any great ideas that no one else is trying. It's just, it's being well led. And so there is a real link in terms of our best practice visits, where things are working. It's not necessarily because people got great ideas that aren't evident elsewhere. It's just that they're being led really, really effectively.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
So next slide, Steve, which I think might be passing back to Catherine.
Thank you. Okay, so I'll just talk briefly about the... Oh, can you hear
Sorry,
me?
Catherine, I tried to mute myself, but I muted you by mistake.
Charming.
Apologies.
I'll just talk to you briefly about the inclusion framework. As I've said, hopefully you have heard of this in previous briefings. I know some of the schools on the call have been engaged in the inclusion framework process. So, Stephen, if we could pop on to the next slide, please. We often talk about the inclusion framework without actually showing the inclusion framework, which is spectacularly unhelpful. So small as that may be, we are sharing that with you. This is a non-academic framework, which we use to profile children against the skill set that they need to progress through their education and into adult life. And it is designed as a profiling tool to identify where children have barriers, where there is a presenting need. We don't need to launch into a diagnosis or a label because a child is not able to communicate effectively or interact effectively, but we can focus in on that being a barrier to that child, which is likely to then be also a barrier to academic progress, possibly attendance, participation, and so on and so forth. So this started life as a piece of work called Lives Without Labels 5 or so years ago. Since we've written the strategy, we have revised the framework to fit underneath the 6 pillars or the 3 pillars that we've talked about. I think at first that was a bit of paying lip service, in my opinion, to the strategy. However, it has transformed the way that our school leaders are using this and the way that they are feeding back to us. So previously we would have profiled children from bottom to top, simply working through what can they do, where are their barriers. Actually, schools are finding that they profile now bottom to top, but they identify that actually left to right, if there are issues with relationships and well-being, that is often where it gets stuck and they don't see the progress across the rest of the framework. So in that sense, it's been very, very powerful. There is no age-related expectations to this framework at all, and that's very, very important. It's not like Preparing for Adulthood, which has very clear information as to what an age-related expectation is. It is simply, we can probably put ourselves maybe somewhere on there as well as something that we could focus on to work on and be better at. But for our children to really go on and be independent, participating members of society, we would want them to be towards the top of that framework. And where we have children who need additional support, can they do it with that additional support as well? So it is simply a tool. We're not prescriptive in the way that schools use this. Schools get their highlighter pens out. They use this in a variety of ways, and we are working on a digital solution to sit with this as well to make it easier, but simply as a profiling tool to identify barriers and issues for children. And when that barrier or issue is identified, working with their inclusion partner, the team around them, to really come up with a creative solution that doesn't rely on an EHCP or a protracted statutory process, which probably isn't appropriate, particularly for our children with social, emotional, mental health issues, trauma, attachment. A protracted statutory process and a plan is not what they need. They need timely intervention. So we work on much shorter timescales, around 12 to 18 weeks, and we put interventions in place. And there is an opportunity for schools to come to us when it is appropriate, alongside their IP, to a panel to bid for some additional funding to support the programmes that they're putting in place for cohorts of children. Thank you, Stephen. This is some examples. I think we've got a timeline there, which is very important. When we first started this, it was piloted in 21-22. We saw a lot of intervention coming through for individuals where they were really at crisis point, risk of permanent exclusion, and so on and so forth. And whilst that has its place, this is absolutely intended to be an early intervention tool, a tool that class teachers can use to profile children and intervene very, very early. And what is very pleasing to see is that we have gone through the period of time. Not only have we seen much wider engagement across the whole county, and we've got, I think, about 125 schools now have come through for funding. But we are seeing partnership bids. We are seeing bids for large-scale projects that impact on large cohorts of children and will do into the future. And the absolute fundamental part of this process is that this is one-off funding that we will use to do some of these things, repurpose areas, train staff, put in place some innovative and creative equipment and so on and so forth, but that it has to be sustainable, and it will absolutely be designed on the basis of profiled children and cohorts of children, but that will then be there as provision for future cohorts of children. But that gives you a sense of some of the things that we have funded through the inclusion framework, and it's very varied and absolutely needs-led, which is the important part. Thank you, Stephen. This will just, you can read this at your leisure when the slides come around, but some of the feedback, the framework itself was designed in the first place. We work closely with school leaders around the language, so we have a lot of feedback around how it's helpful to have a common language around inclusion. So we have family workers using the framework, healthy schools visitors using the framework, social workers using the framework, educational specialists, and obviously our staff on the ground working with the framework, and that has been very, very powerful. Schools feel that there is access to support much more quickly, so we have a monthly panel for the inclusion framework, and then that access to funding is immediate. So again, the whole purpose is to make sure we get timely intervention for children, not sitting on long statutory processes where they're not needed. Where they're needed, absolutely right, but where they need something different, this is a different and more quick and a quicker impact. And some really, powerful statements come through that, the top one there, the inclusion framework has been the single most effective measure for providing good outcomes for the attendance and attainment of our SEND children. So it is a tool for all children, but obviously it picks up that kind of focus of the spotlight of the strategy with SEND and disadvantage as part of that. Thank you, Stephen. So that's the framework. I will just touch on as well the component of Ready to Regulate, which Dan talked to very briefly earlier. So Ready to Regulate is our professional learning programme that we have developed. This sits as part of trauma perceptive practice. So you have to be a trauma perceptive practice school to engage with Ready to Regulate at this moment in time. But it's a course that we have designed to give staff on the ground in schools the practical skills to support with regulation, co-regulation. We work through the components of regulate, relate, reason and repair. So really, yes, whilst that cultural change might be happening with TPP, it's those staff who are interacting with these children on a daily basis who are working extremely hard, and to give them more tools for that work around regulation and co-regulation. Thank you, Stephen. So, as I've said, to participate in this course, you do have to be a TPP school, and you have to have done some work, which you will have done as part of TPP, to amend policies and practice to reflect that trauma perceptive practice. And that's very much around high structure and high nurture within a behaviour and relationships policy. So there is there are expectations around that. We're training individuals, so it's very important that those individuals are going back into a base school that supports the ethos of the training that we're giving. Of course, there are individuals who absolutely would like to undertake this training, but without that kind of buy-in from leaders on the ground, it's very difficult for us to have the impact that we want to have. Thank you, Stephen. And this is the cost and commitment. So if you're interested in taking this back into your schools, it's a 3-day course. So the commitment is to release the delegates to attend that training. And there is some activity that has to be undertaken in between training sessions. We ask the practitioners, the school, to purchase for the practitioners, the delegates, a resource pack, if you like, which costs about £20. But it's very important that they have that so that they can then take that back into school to use the tools when they're in school. And we do have a login on Hive, which is our platform that we use for trauma perceptive practice, which the practitioner has to have access to, and that costs about £25 a year. So the costs are absolutely minimal. All of the training is absolutely free, but those are the costs that are associated with it. And when these slides come through, there will be some information there on how to book onto that or to share that with your schools. Thank you. I'm handing back to you there, I think, Dan.
Thank you, Catherine. So yeah, just a quick, I know we've talked about this quite a bit, so just a sort of final sort of tie up around the inclusion reviews, if you can move on to the next slide, please, Stephen. So you know, again, you won't be surprised, and this is repetitious, but it's intentionally repetitious. Our approach to inclusion reviews are very much focused around getting under the skin of the strategy and the pillars around the strategy. So when we undertake an inclusion review, we will absolutely look through, you know, try and get under the skin of the vision of the school, the values, the culture, and approaches to inclusion. But we will sort of pull at the threads of relationships, well-being, attendance, participation, achieving, and moving on to really get under the skin of leaders' approach in those key areas, to look at where things are working well and to look at where leaders might need a bit more help. Next slide, please, Stephen. I think what's particularly important, and this slide will possibly mean nothing at the moment, is our intention has always been that the impact of inclusion reviews are bigger than the sum of its parts. And it's really important, and as the year progressed and as we continue to work, it's important that each inclusion review is high quality, is supportive, but is challenging, and gives leaders some real food for thought and celebrates success. But what was also crucial is actually that bigger picture of, well, you know, what do we find out from this? What is the state of inclusion across Essex? Where are the real strengths? Where do we need to take a step back and think about things? And this is a really good example of some of the work we've been able to do as the approach to inclusion reviews has matured. And this table simply identifies where we've made recommendations and what we've made recommendations about. So it's not specific enough to tell you what each recommendation is about, but if you follow the rows across the top, or the columns across the top, you'll be able to see, you know, we've made 26 recommendations around relationships last year, whereas we only made 3 recommendations around participation. We made 24 recommendations around vision, whereas we only made 6 recommendations about people voice. But you can also break it down, if you look at the rows, by the recommendations that we made around different sort of types of school. And so, you know, there were a lot of things that we found were interesting that have come through as themes. You know, for example, the impact of buy-in to trauma-informed practice when we're looking at relationships. One of the things that's been particularly stark is actually the number of recommendations we made around attendance. Now, we know attendance is a concern, and attendance has improved slightly, but not a lot. But we haven't made a lot of recommendations around attendance, and that has thrown a really interesting sort of debate around the fact that school by school by school, schools are all sharing similar high quality approaches to trying to improve attendance, but it's actually it's not doing more of that that's going to improve attendance. Where attendance is particularly strong is where all of the columns are strong. And actually, when we're now starting to look at how do we improve attendance, improving attendance is, you know, it's not about stopping the approaches to attendance that schools are doing really well. It's about saying we need to maintain that, but it's not just about a high quality attendance officer and approaches to communication around attendance or first day callbacks or the attendance team. It's about the culture of the school and the curriculum and whether people feel welcome and a part of the school and cared for. So there's some really interesting sort of themes that are starting to come through, but just by having a quick look at, you know, the different spread of recommendations that we make. Next slide, please, Stephen.
Before you go on to that, Daniel, can I ask, when you do an inclusion review, are you collating a mapping area of certain areas? Because I'm aware of certain schools, and you can draw a circle around another school that hasn't got an inclusion rate. And it would be interesting to know if you are mapping it, so you can say to if the school is in an area that lots of schools are inviting you to do reviews, and you get one that's stuck in the middle that isn't. If you approach that to see why not.
Now, we interesting, and again, we've just spent a bit of time towards the end of last year with some really cool mapping software where we're not just mapping reviews, but we're mapping schools that had taken with the inclusion framework, schools that are involved in Ready to Regulate. So, as you say, so you can really start to get that sense. And that's an area where we're not there yet, simply because we've done 40 reviews last year, and we're going to do, well, at the moment we're planning to do 80 reviews this year, but we're going to try and get that to 120. There are still about 500 schools in Essex, and so it's quite a challenge, to actually really get under the skin, because we still haven't gotten anywhere near the majority just because of the amount of schools that are in Essex. So I think, to your point, Nigel, yes, we're mapping it. Where we get an outlier, like, for example, if we looked at Chelmsford, and if every school in Chelmsford had a review apart from one, then that would be quite a clear and easy way in. But it's not as clear cut as that at the moment. But certainly, as we continue to do more reviews, by the time we get to the end of this year, and we will have done potentially, I don't know, 150, 160, then I think we'll be at a stage where we can say with a bit more certainty, yeah, there might be some trends around this mapping. On to the next slide, please, Stephen. And again, the key reason to start to really reflect on where the recommendations, or what the recommendations are telling us at a broader level, is then enabling us to say, okay, well, what do we want to offer next to schools? Because the feedback we've had from schools has been incredibly positive, but we don't want to just do a review, leave some recommendations, and go. I spent a couple of years working for Ofsted as one of His Majesty's inspectors. Before, my passion is school improvement, and the most frustrating thing to do when you inspect schools is you leave some recommendations and then you clear off. Actually, no. How can we work collectively as a system to really build on the strengths, but also to work together to address areas that need to improve? And so what we've started to do is to say, well, actually, how can we work across the piece with schools that have had inclusion reviews? So if you just move on to the next slide, please, Stephen. What we've got on these 5 squares are some of the things that we've already spoken with school leaders about in terms of how we can bring people together to support system development. And the whole philosophy underpinning our inclusion work is not that we've got the answers. It's that we want to get alongside school leaders to bring school leaders together to support the system to develop itself. And that's why, as our reviews mature, we bring more school leaders into being part of the review teams. It's about getting everyone to work together, as opposed to this being an Essex thing. But the 5 things that we're now looking at how we develop moving forward. So, for example, a facilitated workshop, very simply, if we've got 6 schools or 1 school, with similar recommendations, can we offer them the opportunity to come together to work collectively to almost be coached and look at their responses to that one recommendation? If we know we've got 3 schools that are really struggling with an issue, and we're going to a school on a visit which is a real strength in that issue, can we offer leaders the opportunity to come with us, come and see what's going on? For those schools that might want to be involved in a sort of facilitated workshop where they have to actually plan together, can we actually offer 4 or 5 schools, maybe 10 schools, the opportunity to come together for a conference? If we've got a number of schools that are all struggling with their ability to develop their own culture and ethos and their vision, then can we run a conference for those schools to come to and join us in? Can we offer coaching and mentoring to schools from experienced head teachers? Some schools have come to us and said, look, we'd really love you to come back in a year to either do another review or to do a really sort of focused review on just looking at how they've done with the recommendations. So this is the suite of post-review activities we're now developing, so that we can go back to those schools that have had reviews last year and say, look, as well as doing the reviews for schools this year, we want to work with you colleagues to sort of help you move forward. So that's what we're working at the moment. Next slide, please, Stephen. And again, this sort of summarises a lot of the work we've done and a lot of the stuff I've talked about already. But, you know, some key headlines when we're looking at reviews. We haven't been into many schools where there isn't a fundamental commitment to inclusion. And that might well be linked to the fact that, you know, schools have invited us in. We've not invited ourselves in. But we know in almost all examples, we see a fundamental commitment to inclusion. What's been quite interesting as we've gone from school to school to school is the extent to which that commitment to inclusion is strategic, you know, to the extent to which the vision is underpinned by anything. And that, you know, those next two bullet points in italics are some key things that we do as part of the inclusion review activity. You know, actually asking not just the leaders, but the teachers, the support staff, the governors, the parents, the pupils, you know, what does inclusion mean at this school? And we talk about, and this is a bit naff, but forgive me, we talk about the Ferrero Rocher effect. And then you know, and if you remember the advert in the 80s, and it was not so much the ambassador or the Ferrero Rocher, but they always started with the pyramid of champagne glasses, and they'd pour the champagne in the top, and it would filter down into all the glasses because all of the glasses were perfectly aligned. And that really is the approach when we're looking at culture and impact and vision, and working out the extent to which those glasses are aligned in schools. And you know, that is a key work that, you know, we're working at. And certainly when we work with governors, and we're sort of putting a bit of challenge to governors about, you know, well, you know, what is inclusion at your school, and actually how do you monitor it and how do you evaluate it? And again, the vision, the clarity around this is what it means here is always there. But often when we start to break it down, actually, okay, well, what do you mean by that? How do you monitor and evaluate your approaches to inclusion? What we're seeing in quite a lot of schools is that is when it becomes a little bit more woolly. On to the next slide, please, Stephen. Now, what I'm not going to do, because I know I've been talking for quite a while, is I'm not going to read any of the next 6 slides, but I would suggest that they might be helpful things to reflect on when you look at your own schools. What we've done, as well as ethos, values, and culture, if you want to move through to the next slide, Stephen, we've got a slide that looking at relationships. On to the next slide, please, Stephen. I can't see a slide that's looking at attendance and participation. And finally, Stephen, there should be a slide that's looking at achieving and moving on. And what we've tried to do in each of those slides is to identify, when we've done reviews across Essex, when we're looking at the 40 or 50 reviews that we've done so far, the bullet points on the left are those that identify where we are seeing a sort of consistent level of good practice, a consistent level of strength across Essex. And the bullet points that we're identifying on the right-hand side are, you know, where we are seeing across a range of schools issues or topics that schools are finding more of a struggle. And certainly, you know, rather than read them out to you now, I think it's probably, you know, hopefully a valuable piece of work that maybe that's something that you want to sit down and share with your head teachers and your senior leaders when you meet with them, and say, look, you know, this is the sort of findings that are coming across through Essex. Yeah, are those the same challenges that you're finding, or do you feel you're doing all right with them? And just maybe start to use this sort of these final 4 slides as things that could prompt conversations with your head teachers about inclusion and about the bigger picture in Essex and the extent to which that has been reflected in your schools. And on to the next slide, please, Stephen. And this will absolutely give you the opportunity to stop hearing me talk. This is a sort of a brief video. One of the things that we try to do is, you know, not make this about us, but make it about you and your schools and the young people in your schools. And so we work closely with head teachers who are involved in the strategy, who are involved in reviews, who are involved in the framework, who are involved in Ready to Regulate, and really try to give as many examples of, you know, impact, so that, you know, it will inspire and hopefully encourage other schools to get involved and to see what's going on. And this is a video from Beauchamps High School in Wickford, who have been involved in the inclusion framework, certainly from the early days, and gives just an insight of the work that they've been doing and the impact it's had.
Here at Beauchamps, we are just a normal comprehensive school, but we've just really bought into inclusion and what that means. We are not a specialist SEND provision. We don't have a specialist hub of any kind. We're just trying to provide the very best that we can for all of our students, including those with SEND and our lower attaining students. 2-3 years ago, we just didn't have the skills or the right curriculum to cope with the level of need. So we've worked really hard over the last couple of years to improve that and get it right. And that tied in perfectly with the Inclusion Framework pilot, which came to my attention.
The Inclusion Framework really helped us, give us the confidence really to think outside of the box. It's great when you have a vision as a SENCO in a school and you've got a head teacher that aligns with that vision, but it's also really good to know that the local authority will support that.
I've been having loads of support in my lessons, and it's made me feel more confident of how I'm going to do well in life, because I'm going to college and I'm coming up to my GCSEs.
We've created an area that we can now help our children study things that aren't necessarily on the mainstream curriculum, things like horticulture, things like animal care. We have a lovely brand new created an area that we can now help our children study things that aren't necessarily on the mainstream curriculum, things like horticulture, things like animal care. We have a lovely brand new
doesn't like it beyond that point. I'll see if I can just push it past that. I'm afraid it doesn't seem to like getting past that point of the animal care and the horticulture, I'm afraid.
As a taster, we'll send the full video with the slides.
And that sort of brings us to the final slide, which is, again, not something that we want to spend ages on now, unless as a group of governors you want to, but I think some key questions that we felt might be helpful for you as governors. I think one of the key things, and you know, we speak about this a lot, is, and it's really valuable to be offered to come and talk to you, and other opportunities to speak to governors, is the importance of governing bodies is so significant. And you know, and I know, you know, I've been the head of 3 different secondary schools in Essex. A strong, supportive, powerful governing body is exactly what you want, and it can be a challenge, because getting high quality governors can be a challenge. But you know, it's, and Catherine, Stephen, jump in and support me, tell me I'm talking rubbish. This might sound controversial. In some ways, it can be easier as a head teacher to be uninclusive than it can be to be inclusive. And there can be pressures on you from all sorts of angles to be uninclusive, and actually what every head teacher needs in my book is a strong governing body stood behind them, who are fully committed to inclusion and understand the challenges of being inclusive, but have absolutely got their back and absolutely support them with those challenges. And it is a challenging landscape at the moment, and certainly from an ECC perspective, we're trying to do all we can to get alongside school leaders to try and put stuff in place. You know, this isn't going to change the world by itself, but you know, our view is it's a start and it's making an impact. But certainly, you know, the role of governors in offering support and challenge around this important issue is absolutely crucial.
Thank you, Daniel. Thank you, Catherine. And thank you, Stephen, for working behind the scenes there. So we've got a bit of time for any questions. I would ask of you to sort of unmute yourself and show a hand by using the react button below. And feel free to ask any questions.
What I'll sort of jump in while people are giving a bit of thought is, I will apologise if we've created any sense of overwhelm. It was only when, as we started to go through it, you know, we've shared with you an awful lot of information about the work that we've been doing over the last few years. And actually, I don't know whether Catherine, Stephen, you agree, but it's only as you're sort of going through slide by slide by slide, you know, we've shared a lot of information there. So equally, we're happy if colleagues want to sort of fire questions once you've had time to reflect on it. We can respond to them via email as well, if that helps.
While we're waiting for any questions, your flow chart you showed, Catherine, with the different stages, do you have an example of where a child should give raise for concern by using that step chart?
So no, I think that's the purpose of it being there's not a kind of class, there's not a profile. So there's not a typical profile that a 4-year-old should look at like, or a 24-year-old. It is where, as a professional or a team of professionals or the family, we involve the family in that profiling, where they feel that that is a barrier. But then looking underneath that at what the need is. So we have a lot of children who present in that kind of very low, not making it eye contact, not having positive interactions. So that the professionals say, you know, this issue of them not being interact positively is a huge barrier to all of the other aspects of what we're trying to do. I think in some schools, for example, that very quickly leads to this child needs assessment, this child probably has autism, this child needs a diagnosis, this child needs an EHCP. Actually, what do we really need to do over the next 12, 18 weeks to focus in very small steps to try and address that barrier? Let's not leap to any other things. Let's not bring in huge components of curriculum. Let's focus very, very clearly on a creative solution that will help to address that barrier for that child in a very personalised way. So it is really about where something is deemed to be a barrier that is stopping that progress for that child and how we can remove it across that framework.
Thank you, Catherine. Patrick, your hand is up. Would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, hi. Thank you so much. It's really, really helpful. Lovely to see all of that information. We were lucky enough, I'm the chair at Hatfield Peppermint Infants. We were lucky enough to receive quite a large fund over the summer. We've got a wellbeing cabin put in, which was really nice. It's given us some more space, breakout space for some of the children who need that. I've got two questions for you. One is it case by case? So obviously we got that funding. That was lovely. Don't want to be greedy, but you know, if we come up with another good idea, is that the kind of thing we can also put in? You know, as a chair, I'm thinking more into sort of the next couple of years, if that makes sense. You know, if the SEN team kind of think of something else or something like that, can they sort of re-raise? If it's a good idea and it's the right kind of concepts, is it limited to the school?
No. So the whole purpose is it has to be based on the profiling. So you have identified the need through the profiling using the framework, so that then when we do the reviewing and measure the impact, we see that those barriers have been removed and there are children making progress where they might not have been otherwise. Where we have schools coming back and saying, you gave us funding, it's been brilliant for 2 years, we slightly miscalculated and actually we can't manage without more money, then that's a problem. Sure, because the whole purpose is sustainability. So we don't fund staffing unless it is staffing costs to kind of do a bit of cover so that training can happen. That might happen, but we wouldn't fund a member of staff because that can't be sustainable.
No, makes sense.
But if you had another cohort of children presenting with something that made you think of something different and another creative solution, absolutely we would consider that bid in addition to a bid that you've already had. What we've seen in the best cases is where schools have had a successful bid, have really embraced the process, it's really had an impact for them, and then they've worked with their partnership or a number of schools around them to really kind of think even larger scale for those cohorts of children who perhaps are similar. And then that's when we get quite excited then when we start to see schools coming together to do some additional bids as well.
Okay, that's really interesting. Thank you. Sorry to grab a second, but my second question was around staff. I kind of saw something on a slide that I didn't quite understand. Was you'd mentioned something at the end of one of the slides, which was around additional sort of support staffing. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
We have a class that has a particular need within it, and we are sort of funding additional SEN and sort of staff costs there, which is fine. We're lucky enough we can do that at the moment, but it's obviously eating into budgets and things like that. Yeah. Again, I know that you don't fund that under the inclusion bit, but I didn't quite understand whether you were saying we'll give you some cash towards a staff member, or we'll help you where we can provide you a staff member.
No, so that's no, absolutely. So that's the frustration we have. So because of the limitations that our self-imposed limitations, and rightly so, in terms of sustainability for the bids through the inclusion framework, there are two outstanding issues that still then prevent children from accessing the provision that they need. One, and schools have difficulty funding. One is transport sometimes.
Yep.
And that's a whole other issue which we won't get into. But the other is staffing. So the purpose of that pilot is that we're going to try quite small scale. We've worked closely with Devon local authority recently, supporting them. But one of the things that we've seen in their work is they have a bank, if you like, of specialist support assistants that work and are trained by the local authority. So we would train them up in our Ready to Regulate programme, etc. And then we would hold them. But where perhaps you might need somebody to help with perhaps a child's transition or a particular issue, perhaps alongside inclusion framework work, we could deploy them to you for a short period of time. So you're not tied into long-term employment contracts, etc. So that's the thinking. We're going to start small. We're going to get a bank of, so not so much of a bank, but a group of 4 to start with, and then see through that test and learn what that looks like.
Really helpful. Thank you very much. That makes a lot of sense.
Okay, I've got a couple of questions on the chat. One from Susie's iPad. Any tips on how to reach parents who are reluctant to engage in giving their views?
Yes, phone them. and that's not, it might sound like I'm being funny, but one of the things that we do with our inclusion reviews is we give sample timetables. We want us to do this, that, the other. We always ask to speak with what we and it's an interesting phrase. We used to say we want to speak to hard to reach parents. And as we started to do some work a bit nationally, people saying, you shouldn't be saying hard to reach, you should be saying seldom heard. And it's like, oh God, when you talk about parents as being hard to reach, it's like it's not your fault, it's not your responsibility. And when you start talking about seldom heard, well, yeah, if they are seldom heard, what can we do to encourage parents to be heard? So on every inclusion review, we will say to school leaders, can you please tee us up with X amount of seldom heard parents who we can speak to. Now, there are challenges around that because you will not always get hold of the seldom heard parents because they are challenging to get hold of sometimes. But I think what we've tried to do, and this is just a small example, is absolutely target who those parents are and then go on the front foot. And sometimes that's a case of you meet them outside of school. Again, a broader challenge is very much around the approach in secondary, because again, sweep and generalization often at primary levels, you will still, the seldom heard parents will still be bringing their pupils to school. So you've got a bit more of a chance of grabbing and talking to. But I think that the simple answer, which isn't a simple action, is to actually to be totally on the front foot and not just blanket bomb parents and get the same parents sending the surveys back, not just asking people to join the PTA or the parent voice group and get the same parents coming back, but actually being really clear and strategic about these are the parents who we need to engage with and making a plan. And I suppose that's the first question is how many schools in Essex have actually got a strategic plan of how to engage seldom heard parents. And we see the same thing with and the head teachers are sort of all saying, yeah, you're right. Is you talk about pupil voice and how how the kids' feedback is given, and very, very often, in spite of all of the approaches to get the voice of everyone, it's the same kids giving the same feedback, and the seldom heard kids aren't being strategically brought into the conversation. So I think the quick answer is to have a plan, and to sort of from a governance point of view, to be challenging your leaders to say, what is the strategic plan to get the views of our seldom heard parents? To what extent do our approaches to people voice, do our approaches to school council, are they really getting the feedback of the seldom heard kids? And how do you know? Because often they're not.
Yeah, and I would just add to that, absolutely. And I think the language around seldom heard has been very powerful for our leaders on reflection. But the other thing as well is the family worker support pilot that we are putting in under one of those pillars. Again, just a very small test and learn pilot, small group of schools, one family support worker working alongside our colleagues in supporting families in recognition of high levels of dysregulation of children coming in, particularly into our reception years, where we can see, and our schools are telling us, that the family dynamic is incredibly difficult, and for these children coming into a formal setting for the first time, reaching those families is increasingly difficult. So that pilot, that test and learn, is designed to try and answer some of those questions as well. What more could we do between pre-statutory social care services and ourselves in education to better get into families early, perhaps before they lose their confidence and faith in some of the professionals around them as well? So I think there's absolutely, as Dan says, once you're in a school, once you're in a setting, that you can have approaches. As governors, you can challenge what that looks like and what the strategic plan is. And we're trying to do a little bit of test and learn as to what more we can do systemically, holistically, to join up some of the dots.
And I think just to add, one of the most, and Catherine, you've been on a load of reviews as well. I'm sure you'll agree. One of the most powerful elements of all of our inclusion reviews are when, and to be fair, when we say to head teachers, we want to speak to your seldom heard kids, generally, and we always say to heads, we're not going to check whether they're really seldom heard. You're going to get as much out of this as you put into it. But please give us the pupils who you would say are seldom heard. And the power in those conversations is, and I've spent a lot of time doing this sort of stuff. It's really humbling, because there's a preconception that you're going to get some of the most challenging or most vulnerable or most withdrawn young people who are either going to say nothing or are just going to throw the school under the bus. And it's neither. They're the most humbling conversations of young people who really care, are often very grateful for lots of elements of school life, but can also give some real examples of how school life isn't working for them, and can be really constructive about what could be done better. And so, that's I think something I think we've all found really powerful on the reviews.
Okay, thank you both for that. Go back to Ruth. She asked the question around specialist support assistants, and then added at the bottom that Catherine may have just answered that. Do you want any clarification on that one, Ruth?
Sorry, I just wondered if you'd actually thought of scenarios where you would actually use one of these support assistants.
Yeah, so I think a good example is, again, it was born from a bit of frustration when we're sitting on panel, we're approving really exciting plans and provision and so on and so forth, but actually there is still a question mark around, okay, there is a sort of transition element for these children that actually they can come out, they can have some respite provision in a kind of SEMH sense, or support, outdoor learning, whatever the provision is. But actually the translation of those skills back into the mainstream classroom is not straightforward. You don't just take children out and pop them back in. So where is it that, in terms of supporting classroom teachers, the intervention itself, that transition back in, that might only be a 12-week process. So you're not going to appoint a teaching assistant or an LSA or a specialist to do that in your school for 12 weeks, but perhaps we could deploy that as part of the package that we approve as part of some of the framework bids is what we're thinking.
Thank you very much. Any further questions? Yes, Victoria.
I'm really new to all this governor stuff, but I am a clinical psychologist by trade, and I'm really familiar with the regulate, relate, reason model. I am a governor of a really tiny school, and I was thinking about how, even though the training that you've got there is free, that the staffing to cover the staff to go on the training would be the issue. But you did actually say that there would be some funding perhaps to help with that. But I didn't know if there's any way for someone like me to lay eyes on the training, because I could easily give that training to our school staff, but I really would rather that it was in line with what you are doing than kind of just go in there with the stuff that I'm familiar with.
It's very interesting. I'm going to add governors to the list then of, obviously we're considering a ready to regulate for families, a ready to regulate for early years, but we could look at a training session for governors ready to regulate. Yeah, I'll add that to the list. Thank you very much. It's very helpful.
Is there any way though to see the package, or would we have to sign up to the package to see it?
Yeah, I mean, it's mostly in the facilitation. The materials are fairly standard. They're probably very similar to what you will have seen. So it's very much about the training itself is very much focused on the individuals that you are the intervention. It's not, nurture is not a room, and all of those sorts of concepts. That actually it's very much about you being emotionally available. So it's quite an immersive experience in terms of delving into oneself and so on and so forth. The materials are probably what you would expect. But let me take it away. It might be that if we just come alongside you, Victoria, then we could come up with a plan. We might be able to give you access to the Hive materials. Perhaps you could give us your thoughts and so on and so forth. So I will follow it up, definitely.
Got another model that you might be interested in as well, so we could talk about that at the same time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
If I could just grab your email, Victoria, that'd be really helpful, if that's okay. Thank you.
Lovely. That's a very good question, Victoria. Thank you very much. Time is pressing on. I've got time for just one more question, if there is any. Victoria has just put her email address on the chat line, Catherine. Are you able to pick that up?
I've got it. Thank you.
Lovely. Thank you. So, in conclusion, just a big thank you to Daniel and Catherine and Stephen for giving their time today to highlight the needs of inclusion in our schools. Thank you all for attending. We will be sending out, give me a chance during this busy schedule to get all the slides, which Stephen has already sent through to me. Thank you, Stephen. And there will be a recording with it. Please share with your governing bodies. Along with that, we as ESCA are here to support our governors. We'd love to know what your dire needs are. To that end, with the slides and the recording will come a link to a survey. We put together a survey so we can focus on your needs. We have the regular coffee and chats. And our next one we're hoping will be on the new Essex Infolink site with Shamsun Noor. And then when the government have decided what they're going to do, we have Carol Herman of Ash lined up on the topic of what next. And I'd love to know what next will be. So thank you all for attending. Thank you once again for Catherine, Daniel and Stephen. And we wish you well in your various schools. Ruth, do you wish to add anything?
Yeah, just a huge thank you. I did change computers halfway through, so I might have missed a little bit snippet in the middle. Thank you for what you've presented this evening. I found it very interesting, and I'm sure most of you did as well. So, but look forward to seeing you at our next coffee and chat. Thank you. Thank you, Daniel. Thank you, Catherine.
No problem.
Thank you very much.
And you, Stephen. Sorry.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
I'm going to end recording and say goodbye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Take care.